Sreda's mother stormed back to the house, banging on the door with frustration and determination. When the door finally opened, there stood Vichika, wearing nothing but a thin, transparent negligee. Without hesitation, her mother pushed past her, stepping inside the house. There, on the bed, was Vichith, lying comfortably in just a pair of shorts. The two looked startled, clearly caught off guard as they appeared to be preparing for something more intimate. Both froze in shock, their expressions revealing a mix of guilt and fear. Hello, and welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into another shocking real-life event that will leave you speechless. This time, the story comes from the heart of Phonsavan City, Laos. It's about a family that was torn apart by the presence of one young man whose favorite pastime was charming everyone around him and leaving his mark wherever he went. What exactly happened? Let's unpack this wild and deeply unsettling story together. Buckle up, it's going to be a ride. Before we dive into this intriguing story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share this story with your friends too, it's one you won't want to keep to yourself. So here's how it goes. There was a beautiful woman named Mrs. Sreda, born in February 1962, in Thuang, Laos. She got married and moved to Phonsavan City with her husband in 1982. At just 20 years old, Mrs. Sreda became a mother to her first daughter, Rachana. 12 years later, she gave birth to her second daughter, Vichika. With such a significant age gap, their family dynamic was unique, but Sreda handled it all gracefully. Despite being a woman in a traditionally male-dominated business world, Mrs. Sreda was incredibly savvy. She started by selling bags and clothes at the market. Later, with the encouragement of a friend, she expanded into running a workshop, selling motorcycle spare parts, and buying and selling used motorcycles. By 2013, she owned a motorcycle body painting factory, specializing in accessories and custom bodywork for all major brands. Her eldest daughter, Rachana, had already joined the family business by then, helping her mother grow their enterprise. In 2016, Vichika, the youngest daughter, was preparing to finish college and decided to join the family business as well. Although she initially considered working elsewhere, her parents persuaded her to stay. After all, the family business was well established, secure, and could support her for years to come. So, Vichika agreed and began learning everything she could from her mother and sister. In February 2017, just as Vichika was graduating, her longtime boyfriend Sovan proposed. They had been together for 3 years and were a perfect match. On May 3, 2017, the couple got married. Vichika was 23, and Sovan was 25. Sovan proved to be a caring and responsible husband, adored by his in-laws and respected for his hard work. But life wasn't without its challenges. On February 9, 2018, tragedy struck when Sreda's husband passed away due to illness. At the time, Vichika was 7 months pregnant. The family was devastated, especially Mrs. Sreda, who was heartbroken and withdrew from everyone, locking herself in her room for 3 weeks. However, a glimmer of hope arrived 2 months later when Vichika gave birth to a baby boy on April 10, 2018. The new addition brought life back into their home and reignited Mrs. Sreda's spirits. Vichika and her husband Sovan lived with her mother, while Rachana, now married, had moved out. Their home was bustling again, and the future seemed bright for the family. Since her husband passed away, Mrs. Sreda had been feeling more stressed than ever. Even though her house was still full of life with her children and grandchildren, there was a quiet emptiness in her heart that she couldn't shake. To cope with her loneliness, she started hanging out with some socialite moms, joining meditation groups or just getting together to chat and pass the time. It was through one of these social gatherings that she met a handsome 25-year-old man named Vichith. They hit it off right away, and their connection only deepened as they continued to see each other. They began meeting up at a local bar for drinks and conversation. Vichit had worked at the bar before but had left that job to help a friend at a car wash. With some savings, he eventually opened his own business selling plain t-shirts both online and in person. But he still liked to stop by the bar for a drink whenever he wasn't busy, mostly for nostalgia's sake. 2 months after meeting Vichit, Mrs. Sreda felt comfortable enough to bring him home and introduce him to her children and son-in-law. Vichika was pretty relaxed about it, figuring that her mom wouldn't be lonely anymore. But Sovan, on the other hand, wasn't so sure. He couldn't help but feel that Vichit might just be after her money, especially since Mrs. Sreda was a successful businesswoman with a motorcycle body painting factory. Sovan's suspicions grew since Vichit had met his wife's mom at a bar, which didn't sit right with him. He tried to talk to his wife, asking her to warn her mom not to get involved with someone like Vichit, but Vichika just shrugged it off. "Oh, they're just having fun. They won't be serious, it'll pass," she said. A few weeks later, Mrs. Sreda took Vichit to her factory to show him around. She even spent the whole day with him in her office, chatting and working together. Rachina wasn't thrilled about the situation, but she mostly kept quiet. It was clear that her mom was really happy when Vichit was around, and that made her smile more than she had in a long time. Mrs. Sreda's life seemed to shine again whenever he was near. By early September 2018, Mrs. Sreda made an announcement to her children. She and Vichit were planning to get married in less than 2 weeks. Rachina and her husband were upset, but they accepted it. Rachina made sure to clarify one thing: the 35% stake in the factory was hers, and no one could contest it. Meanwhile, Sovan wasn't on board with the whole thing. He didn't like the idea of his mother-in-law marrying such a young man, and he worried that Vichit might have bad intentions. He voiced his concerns to Vichika, but she brushed them off, saying, "What do you want me to do? Mom's made up her mind, and Vichit is a good guy. If you're worried about money, don't be. Mom's made sure everything's set up for their future kids." So, despite all the tension, Mrs. Sreda and Vichit went ahead and tied the knot in early October 2018, on a Sunday. After the wedding, Vichit moved in with them, and he started helping out with the administration at the family business. So now, there were 2 admins, Vichika and Vichit. Sovan wasn't thrilled about this. Even though Vichika and Vichit were just working together, it made Sovan uncomfortable. He couldn't shake the feeling that Vichit might be up to something, especially since he saw how close they were at work and around the house. Sovan couldn't help but wonder if he was going to lose his wife to the younger guy, especially since he knew he couldn't compete with Vichit's energy and charm. By the end of 2018, things only got worse, with Vichika and Vichit spending even more time together. Sovan's jealousy grew. Finally, on January 1, 2019, Sovan made a bold move. He asked Vichika to move out of her parents' house. He said they needed to live on their own, to be more independent. It took some convincing, but in the end, Vichika agreed. By mid-January 2019, they rented a small house about 10 kilometers away from Mrs. Sreda's place. Sovan's mind was finally at ease, or so he thought. But things took an unexpected turn. Just 2 months after moving, Vichika started coming home less and less. She said it was due to work issues at the factory. There were machine breakdowns, customer complaints, tax reports piling up, and on top of that, her mom was sick. Then, on March 3, 2019, Rachina messaged Sovan to let him know that Vichika had withdrawn 100 million IDR from the factory account for personal reasons. When Sovan confronted Vichika about it, she said she was planning to open a savings account for their 2-year-old son. A couple of days later, Vichika said she needed to go to work, but she never showed up at the office. Rachina asked Sovan if he had heard from her, and he hadn't. Vichika's phone was off for a whole day before she finally got in touch. When Sovan went to the office, the only person there was Vichit, taking care of the admin department. The next day, Vichika finally called her husband and sister, Rachana, to let them know she was out of town in Luang Prabang, handling some business with a friend. They were furious and told her to come home right away, but Vichika wouldn't hear it. She promised to come back as soon as her business was finished. Then, she called her mother, Mrs. Sreda, and after chatting for a while about a new business she was interested in, she asked her mom to transfer 300 million IDR. Mrs. Sreda, not entirely convinced her daughter could pull this off, only sent half of it. On top of that, Vichika asked her mom not to tell her husband or brother about the money. Mrs. Sreda reluctantly agreed. For the next 2 weeks, Vichika's phone was off, and she didn't come home. However, she did call her mom every other day from a landline, assuring her not to let anyone worry about her. She asked her mom to pray for her business, hoping everything would go smoothly, and promised to come home once her work was done. Mrs. Sreda did as requested, keeping quiet and waiting for her daughter to return. Weeks turned into a month, and Vichika still hadn't returned, nor did she inform her husband about her whereabouts. Then, by the end of June 2019, Vichit shocked Mrs. Sreda by asking to separate. He broke up with her through a WhatsApp message. Mrs. Sreda was stunned and immediately asked Vichit to come home and talk things over, but it was too late, his phone was no longer reachable. Meanwhile, Sovan had been searching high and low for his wife, becoming suspicious about Vichit's sudden request for a breakup. He went to the bar and car wash where Vichit used to work, hoping to find a lead on his whereabouts. After some digging, he found out that Vichit had moved, but an old neighbor pointed him in the right direction. The neighbor mentioned that Vichit and Vichika had been living in a rented house on the outskirts of Fonsavan city for about a month. Sovan didn't waste any time. He drove straight to the house, showed the neighborhood chief a picture of his wife, and asked if he knew where they were. The response was more surprising than Sovan expected. "Oh, that's Mrs. Vichika. She and Mr. Vichit moved here about a month ago. They're newlyweds. They do live here, but I can't give you any details on where exactly. We have rules here, and I need permission from the person first before I share any info." Unfortunately, since Vichika's contact number was still unreachable, Sovan was forced to head home, feeling utterly defeated and heartbroken. When Sovan got home, he immediately told his mother-in-law and sister-in-law everything that had happened. Both were upset and furious, and the very next day, July 2, 2019, Sovan and Mrs. Sreda decided to go back to the house. After explaining to the neighborhood chief that they were the husband and parents of the missing person, they were finally given the full address. But when they arrived, the house was empty. Sovan escorted his mother-in-law home, telling her to wait there, not wanting to cause a scene. However, later that night, around 10 p.m., Mrs. Sreda left the house without Sovan knowing and went back to the rented house. She knocked hard on the door until it was opened. Sure enough, Vichika was the one who answered, wearing only a sheer negligee. Without hesitation, Mrs. Sreda barged in. Inside, Vichit was lounging on the bed, wearing nothing but shorts. It was clear they had been preparing for something more intimate. The moment they saw Mrs. Sreda, both were caught off guard and went silent, stunned by her sudden appearance. Vichika immediately apologized, but Mrs. Sreda, who was already overwhelmed with emotion, pulled out a small knife from her bag. Without warning, she repeatedly pointed the knife at Vichit's head. It's almost like some hidden strength took over her. Even Vichit, who was much younger and stronger, couldn't resist for long. In a fit of rage, Mrs. Sreda slapped her daughter hard across the face before storming out of the house. She went straight to the police station, where she turned herself in. Sadly, Vichit was found dead at the scene, at the age of 27. On the other side, Mrs. Sreda was deeply hurt and betrayed by her young husband, Vichit. She discovered that, over the course of their 9-month marriage, Vichit had been transferring money from the factory account to his personal account, around 30 million IDR every month. It started off small, but it added up over time. Mrs. Sreda had turned a blind eye to it because she was so in love with him. But when she realized that he had run off with her daughter, that was the breaking point. Vichika, still so young and innocent, had been manipulated by Vichith. Mrs. Sreda saw it clearly. Vichith had brainwashed her youngest daughter, convincing her to take money from the office. That, along with the emotional betrayal, was what drove her to attack him. When Vichika was interviewed, her face showed nothing but regret. She confessed that when she worked at the factory with Vichith, the two of them had an inappropriate relationship. It wasn't just one time, it happened often. She admitted she fell in love with him because of his warmth and attention. Eventually, she got pregnant with his child and felt pressured to marry him, though only in a religious sense. In the end, Vichika paid the price for her actions, and the consequences were far heavier than she ever imagined. Lawyer Bori, who represented Mrs. Sreda, tried to argue that she shouldn't be punished but instead treated for her mental health. He used her deteriorating health as a shield, suggesting she was not fully responsible for her actions. A police doctor's evaluation confirmed she showed signs of Alzheimer's and high blood pressure, conditions that could explain some of the cognitive decline, memory loss, and impaired judgment. However, the prosecutor didn't see it that way. They pointed out that, on the day of the incident, Mrs. Sreda had a weapon in her bag, which suggested she had planned everything in advance. After a lengthy legal battle, the final court decision came on September 25, 2019. The judge ruled that Mrs. Sreda was guilty of committing premeditated murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, but due to her poor health, the sentence was somewhat softened. She was eligible for parole after serving 10 years in prison. Meanwhile, Vichika, who was 7 weeks pregnant at the time, was also charged for her involvement in the illicit relationship and her marriage to a man already married to her mother. She was sentenced to a month in prison for her actions. As for Sovan, despite everything, he stayed loyal to his wife. Even after learning that she was pregnant with another man's child, he still accepted her back. It was a complicated, painful situation, but Sovan continued to wait for her, hoping to rebuild their life together. What lessons can we learn from this story?